So we've just come out of this 3-day conference on safety and security. And we have colleagues here from Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, Kenya, Mozambique, Namibia, and of course South Africa. And part of what we've been discussing over the last 3 days is how access to justice and development are actually two sides of the same coin and are linked. And so what we wanted to do with this afternoon's discussion is to try and build on that and to really find time for a more nuanced conversation about how development and justice are linked, but then also to unpack one of the key issues that's actually been missing from the conversation, and that's really about inequality, which is why we have our esteemed panel with us here today, and why we also have all of you here. We've deliberately provided enough time in the program to have discussion and comments and questions after the panel have had their input. Given that we have a panel of 4 men, yes, it's appropriate that Vuyiseka Dubula will be facilitating and steering our conversation, and actually she's the boss this afternoon. For those of you who don't know Vuyiseka, she is an icon in the human rights sector in South Africa. She's currently manages the Policy, Development and Advocacy Unit at Sonke Gender Justice. Before that, she was the Secretary General of the Treatment Action Campaign. The Treatment Action Campaign was mentioned multiple times during the course of the last 3 days, so even our foreign delegates will know this TAC. Vuyiseka has a string of accolades and awards, and I think it is no overstatement to say that she's a source of inspiration to many young women and activists in the field, certainly myself included. So thank you very much for being here today. I'm going to briefly introduce the rest of our panel so that then we can get straight into the discussion. I will start with Mukelani Dimba, who's sitting next to Vuyiseka. Mukelani was also with us at the conference this week, and some of you have already heard him speak. Mukelani is the Executive Director of the Open Democracy Advice Centre, based here in Cape Town. He has been a stalwart in terms of promoting access to information rights and right to information in South Africa and, in fact, in the rest of the region. ODAC provides a range of services to other civil society organizations, and I think Mukelani will be able to provide valuable input on how the right to information is so intimately linked in terms of access to justice. Next to Mukelani, we actually have one of my bosses. Professor Edgar Pieterse is, amongst other things, a board member of the Open Society Foundation for South Africa. Edgar is also the holder of the NRF South African Chair in Urban Policy, and he's the director for the African Centre for Cities. Many of you will have interacted with Edgar over the years on that basis. He's widely published, of course, and also has a string of accolades and publications and a very diverse area of expertise. So we're looking forward to hearing from Edgar. Next to Edgar is a face that many of you might not know, Robert Muggah, Dr. Rob Muggah, is one of our guests. He's traveled from Brazil to be here. Rob has been part of the conference over the last 3 days. He's a specialist in security and development and has been for many years. He's currently the research director at the Igarapé Institute in Brazil. Rob is affiliated to a half dozen universities in various capacities all around the world. In 2013, he was named one of the top most influential people in violence reduction. His work on technology and how we can use technology for violence prevention has been featured by The Guardian, BBC, and a string of other infamous publications. We've already heard a lot from Rob this week, but not particularly on this topic. So I'm very glad that he's fighting the jet lag to still be standing strong with us here. And then finally, Justice Albie Sachs. For South African colleagues and even those from further afield, Judge Albie needs very little introduction. I will, if you will indulge me, I'd like to read a few of his many accomplishments. In 1991, he won the Alan Paton Award for his book Soft Vengeance of a Freedom Fighter, which I'm sure many of you have read. A revised and updated version was published in October 2011. He's also the author of Justice in South Africa, The Jail Diary of Albie Sachs, Sexism and the Law, and The Free Diary of Albie Sachs. His most recent book, which is available in pretty much all bookshops locally, is called The Strange Alchemy of Life and Law. And this also won the Alan Paton Award, making him the second person to have won it twice. Judge Albie has been responsible for a number of crucial Constitutional Court judgments. He has advanced the field of human rights in various ways. We are deeply humbled to have him with us here today, and we look forward to his input. Vuyiseka is now going to lead us. We've structured the discussion as a conversation, so the panelists will be interacting with one another, and then we're going to open it up for comments and conversation. So, please feel free to grab something else to drink or eat as we're talking, and we look forward to a lively discussion. Thanks.
All right, so this is going to be an open dialogue. There are no protocols today. All protocols are observed if they are. I'm not very good at observing them, but just for that to be noted. So the way we're going to be doing the dialogue today, we're going to ask each of the panelists to give us their own view on a particular question I'm going to ask, and then allow them to respond. I would like them to agree and disagree with each other to make it much more exciting so that we don't all agree on the same thing. We can all disagree in the panel. Of course, not disagree to a point where we have no dialogue. It must come to a point where we can have a dialogue, civil dialogue. I don't have to be, asking people to leave. So the first question I'm going to ask, and I'm going to start with you, Mukelani. From a rights approach and rights perspective, what do you think is the relationship between increased safety, security, inequality, and development? And take that and really place it within a context in South Africa where you have rising inequalities and rising lack of safety, and how would you articulate that connection and that relationship, and what do you think needs to be done to address it or needs to be taken into consideration in the new sustainable development goals? And that question goes for all of you. Once you've given us your reflections and your articulation for it, allow us the space and the audience to piggyback on some of the things you would have said. So I will pick on some of the things that you are saying so that you are aware that I am going to be picking on you.
Thank you, Vuyiseka. Before I start, I would like to congratulate Justice Albie for his excellent choice in shirts. He's got amazing taste in... He sets an impressive sartorial standard. On this issue, I would like to always go back and think about where we come from. We are a country that come from a particular history, a history of exclusion, a history of oppression, and through people like Judge Albie, we've had to basically reimagine society completely. We've gone through a transitional period, which has required that we review the relationship between those who rule and the ruled. By so doing, we seek to change the power dynamics. However, I'm concerned that there's been a strong focus on democratic transition, on political transition, while we forget the economic implications of that transition. And you see it everywhere else on the African continent. We are experiencing amazing levels of economic growth. But what troubles me with these amazing levels of economic growth is that they are happening within a context that is not infused by principles of justice. So where you have economic development or development of any kind without it being rooted on the rule of law and justice, I think that's just a recipe for corruption, a recipe for patronage, a recipe for continued exclusion. Remember what the American constitutionalist Alexander Hamilton said when he said, men are not angels. And I think he was speaking as a man of his time. He should have said, men and women are not angels. You therefore require some auxiliary precautions to ensure that what government does is to the benefit of the people. And I think one of those auxiliary precautions that he was referring to is in fact a constitution that is centered on equality, fairness, and equal opportunity. And in our constitution, we do that by putting in place a body of socioeconomic rights, where we are saying, by enshrining these rights in the constitution, we want to create conditions for people to be able to access opportunities that come with economic development. However, it's quite clear that we are a very far distance from what is in the constitution in terms of creating equality, in terms of creating equity, in terms of creating this situation where there is an equitable share of economic spoils. So I really do think that more needs to be done to bring meaning to these rights that are in the Constitution, particularly as they relate to social and economic rights. It's difficult to do that in a context where government is closing down. And it's not just in South Africa, but throughout the continent, you get a sense that there's a shutting down of democratic space. There is a tendency to frown upon any form of dissent, to frown upon any kind of challenge to the exercise of political power. And so I think there's that interplay, of political transition, economic development, and the ability of the people to speak truth to power. And I think that's what we need to defend. And it's only through justice and rule of law that we can be able to do that.
So, Edgar, the same question, and I guess you will share some of your experiences in spaces where you have been able to influence government, because I'm assuming that this esteemed panelist, is one way or another, you do engage with those in power, both ways, top and bottom. And why has that not, infiltrated in the spaces where it should be to influence the status quo? What can be done to get to that point? Because I'm assuming that, whatever we are discussing here, those in power are aware, and what blocks it from not happening? What is the main barrier from us progressing?
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to be here. So, how many of you, have you discussed the SDGs the last 3 days? So people have gone through all the goals and all of that. Cool. So a couple of questions, and maybe also to respond a little bit, and to then deal with the question of power. Well, in some ways, if you look at the draft SDGs, right, and I guess most people here are from civil society and from activist organizations, something we're often not very good at is to know what the hell to do once we've caught the bus, right? So if you look at the SDGs carefully, it's fascinating to reflect on the difference between if you will, the development consensus, or in the broadest possible terms, given all the constraints of a nation-state system called the United Nations, to contrast that with the MDGs of 2000, when Kofi Annan led the Millennium Declaration. And one of the goals, of course, is a goal on its own, number 10, to reduce inequality within and amongst countries. This was inconceivable a decade and a half ago. Another goal that was inconceivable is the one that is obviously close to my heart, making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Now, interestingly enough, if you go further down, the goals 12 to 15 all try to reflect or refract this consensus that underpins the current round of discussions around this idea of planetary boundaries, right? So essentially what the debate on planetary boundaries signal is that there is a reluctant acknowledgement that the extractive model of economic growth is utterly and profoundly bankrupt. That the system that is propelling everything around the world, everything that we're trying to negotiate, has completely run out of steam and out of ideas, and it is only being propelled by ideology and vested interest of capital, right? So yet, that's acknowledged by the big powers that be. We even managed to get an explicit discussion on inequality as opposed to just a focus on poverty reduction, a la the MDGs of 2000. And if you then think through what that would mean institutionally in terms of the proposals we should be making on how to reorganize and restructure the state and the economy and social life, I would contend, in the interest of being argumentative as my chair instructed me to be, that we are rather bankrupt ourselves, that we don't have very clear proposals on how we can transition from the mess that we are to something that reflects the ideals or the political space and the ideological space that this generation of SDGs have opened up. So this raises profound questions, right? How much of our politics and our disposition remains stuck in a modality of critique? And we are reluctant to get contaminated by this politics of proposition, of imagination, and of experimentation with alternatives with an eye of producing credible frames about how that can be scaled and mainstreamed in a way that is cognizant of the institutionalization of the current system. Right? That's a very different politics. It's not a politics of moral superiority. It is not a politics of saving the poor. It is not a politics of continuously defining one's own, if you will, moral identity on the basis of what you're against. It is a politics of having to be modest, provisional, and open to the fact that whatever experiment you're going to try is probably going to fail and be complicit with the problem. And that calls for a very different kind of ideology, morality, and, if you will, activist practice, right? So coming to the question of how we influence those in power, this issue, in a way, we've seen the movie and we've lived it. So if you look at the Constitution that Judge Sachs has been central to, both in terms of formulation but also in developing an impressive body of jurisprudence, we have, in fact, in a way, caught that bus 20 years ago. And for all intent and purposes, from where I stand in the field that I work, which is urban development, things have gotten worse, despite all of that. So clearly, the question is not simply a matter of codification of justice as refracted through laws and principles and so forth, right? There's something else at work. There's something more complex. And I would argue it is in the realm of the social and the cultural. And it requires not just the naming and shaming of, if you will, vested power, but the prefiguration of power through an enactment of a deep kind of citizenship that is grounded in communities and in the building of public life and community life and the rebuilding of community, which is, in fact, if you will, the harsh edge of the systemic condition of continued inequality, growing inequality, and, of course, systemic injustice. So I can come back to these questions, but I thought I'll just throw out a provocation to start us off, and then I'm happy to be more precise about the question of how do we shift those who have the power to not simply speak one thing and continue to do something else. Thanks.
This is an enormous and far-reaching question. And so I started scribbling some notes down, and they became nonsensical rapidly as I tried scribbling them down. So let me just then shoot from the hip. And maybe shoot's not the right metaphor. But I would say, first of all, that insecurity, the question was, how is insecurity and injustice linked to underdevelopment or development? I think it's sort of a big question. And I'd say, I think insecurity and injustice are global. They're a global phenomena, but some places and people are more insecure and experience more injustice than others. At the risk of presenting a bright and optimistic view, the fact is right now, today, in 2015, we're living in one of the most peaceful, safe, and secure moments in human history. If measured by rates of killing, if measured by rates of injuries experienced as a result of violence, if measured by the number of people dying in wars violently, if measured by the number of people dying of homicidal violence. I don't want to suggest that we're in a good place or that we should be complacent or that we should stop, but there's something in the order of 55 to 60,000 people dying violently in war zones, many more dying from nonviolent causes around the world. That's much less than during the 90s, 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s. There's about 480,000, 500,000 people, depending on how you count, people dying violently in homicide. 10 times more people dying outside of war zones than in them from homicidal violence. So I think it's important as we have this discussion that we think a little bit about where we are in the historical context globally. But we are also in a moment of extreme instability and uncertainty. And I think the comments about this planetary question that were raised by Edgar are important because we have the means and the capabilities of generating a huge amount of uncertainty, violence, and injustice. But I think I think I was brought here to be sort of the empiricist. In strict empirical terms, we're talking about reductions. What's the relationship between that violence, past and present, and development? Well, there is, in fact, a tight empirical relationship, statistically significant relationship between homicidal violence and underdevelopment. And I'll unpack these two concepts. There's also, from the data we have, a relatively tight relationship, statistically less significant, but still significant, between the provision of an access to justice and development outcomes. These two facts, of course, it all depends on how you bake the cake and how you disaggregate those various concepts, but there's strong evidence. So in terms of homicide, there's a strong relationship between homicidal violence, rates of homicide, and success, or failure, to meet goals, certain goals in the MDGs. Namely, goal 1, I think it was goal 3, goal 5, poverty reduction, maternal health, education. Strong relationship between countries and cities that exhibit high rates of homicide and a failure to meet the targets. And those countries that exhibit low rates of homicide and low rates of victimization have a much higher statistical propensity to meet those goals. So we have that. Likewise, the Center for Legal Empowerment did a study looking at the relationship between access to justice and development, and they found a very strong correlation between areas that had high rates of access to justice measured by a variety of metrics and education, income, health. I mean, some of the basic metrics that we use for development. So I think that's important to put that in perspective. There is a relationship. Now, when it comes to the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals that were already mentioned, which everyone knows about, this discussion about violence and justice, and even frankly governance, weren't included in the 8 goals that were ultimately established. And in the conference we discussed this briefly, but they were discussed. They were discussed. I think those who were involved in the formation of the MDGs in the UN Secretariat were keenly aware of what happened in Rwanda, were scarred by the experiences of Rwanda, were aware of the outrageous rates of violence in Colombia at the time Colombia was going through. I'm just speaking to the people who were at our conference. We're sensitive to the struggles that were in South Africa. Mexico wasn't experiencing the same kind of violence then as it is today. In any case, there was an awareness, but it wasn't discussed because it was taboo. The MDGs were formed in the context of a development debate that excluded quite purposely and deliberately discussions that were sensitive to the sovereignty, the domestic jurisdictions of countries and governments. Governments were not particularly keen to have them included. They were discussed briefly, but they certainly weren't included. They're jettisoned from the final text in 1999, and then ultimately in 2000 when the declaration was published. I would add just one small sort of sidebar. The UN Office for Drugs and Crime, which is the UN agency, for what it's worth, that's tasked with talking about issues of crime and violence. We refer to them secretly as, I work on drug policy, so we refer to them as the devil. But they do good work, they do good research. They were unable to publish statistics on homicide and victimization by country up until about 2008. Because the stakeholders of the UN member states said, we did not want to have this information made public about our societies because it would affect investment, credit ratings, tourism, whatever, our dignity, our reputation. When I meet with the foreign minister even today of Brazil, he will say he doesn't realize that Brazil is the #1 country in homicides, 56,000 homicides a year. He doesn't have a clue. So there's a disconnect, I think, between our diplomats and our foreign ministries that are negotiating these texts in New York and the realities of our countries. Now, the SDGs are a little bit different. I would argue that MDGs were formed in a time when development was deliberately excluded politics and issues of insecurity and injustice. I would say the SDGs are different in one way, because I think for the first time within the UN, it's obviously intuitive to everybody in this room, but within the UN, and we're here to talk a bit about the UN, the relationship between development and security was seen as bidirectional. It wasn't just underdevelopment leads to more insecurity. There was a recognition that potentially more safety and more access to justice could lead to more development. That relationship, that correlation, I think is now in the heads. And it almost has become banal, but everyone in the UN now talks about security. Development is impossible, and development without security is impossible. But there's a recognition, I think. It's differently interpreted by different countries, but that kind of correlation exists. So today, just to bring us up to speed, and I'll conclude here, there is this Goal 16, which has emerged in the discussions around the next generation of development goals, which includes peace, access to justice, safety, governance. That was the most controversial part of the entire negotiations in the last 2 to 3 years in New York and around the world, this particular goal. And they just barely got in by a whisker in terms of the text, agreeing it in New York. But it's there. And I think it's born of this evolution of understanding and thinking, and born of, I think, a growing awareness of some of the, I guess, the more robust empirical findings around these relationships. But it's, I would say, fragile. If the negotiations, if there's more horse trading, and there will be more horse trading, but if they get rough, it will be the first thing to go. And so again, I think it's something that we need as a community to be alert to, we need to be forceful about, we need to be continuously and pounding the table. The final comment I'll make just about, because we're here to South Africa, and it's sort of important to mention, homicidal violence and conflict have been going down globally. But as I said, some areas are much more rapidly going down than others. There's been a 40% reduction in homicidal violence in North America and Western Europe in the last 2 decades. No one really understands exactly why, and we'll talk a bit about the relationship between inequality and poverty in a moment. The only places where violence is sort of stabilized, lethal violence and non-lethal violence is stabilized or is going up, is in Latin America and Southern Africa, with a little bit in the Middle East and Central Asia. It's the only place in the world where we're seeing a reverse. And so this raises a bunch of really important questions, and I guess we'll continue the discussion, but in spite of these gains in development, poverty reduction, in some cases income inequality, deconcentration, Brazil is celebrated as this country that's reduced poverty for 40 million people. The violence is off the scale. And that raises a bunch of questions about, is development enough? I suspect it probably isn't. Is justice enough? Is security enough? No. So I think it would be interesting to have a more detailed discussion about solutions.
We've won our freedom. We don't have enough security, and there are great problems of equality. And what's the connection between the three? The way the question is presented somehow indicates the more freedom you have, and the more justice you have, and the more development you have, the more equality you will have, as though somehow each one is interlinked with the other. I have my doubts, like the previous speaker. They're all important for their own sake. We want freedom because we want to be free people. We want development because we want better lives for people. We want justice because we want justice. And what was the other one? Whatever the other one was, we want that because it's because it's a good thing. And we don't have to motivate the need for the one by saying it automatically leads to the other. In our case, I'm asked more than a daily, a bi-daily, tri-daily, quadra-daily, deci-daily basis. Well, Albie, you spent your life fighting for freedom. What do you think of South Africa today? Is this the country you were fighting for? And I say, yes, this is the country I was fighting for, but not the society I was fighting for. And what do I mean by that? I mean that we are a free people. We have a wonderful constitution, and that's meaningful. It's not just a piece of paper. We are speaking openly and freely in this room. We're not checking on who are the security police here, who might be recording what we're saying. We're more likely to appear on Al Jazeera than we are in the files of anybody in Pretoria any of these days. And it's tremendous, and we take it for granted. And in a sense, it's marvelous we take it for granted. In a sense, it's sad. Our president stepped down after 2 terms, maximum. We can think of neighbors. One country where we have a king who never steps down. Another country, president's been there for 30-odd years or more. That's taken for granted in those countries. Our presidents not only stepped down after 2 terms maximum, the first president stepped down after 1 term. The second president stepped down not because the military took over or 1 million people went out into the Grand Parade. He stepped down because the Congress of his party voted for another leader. It was done democratically in those terms. Maybe not graciously, but certainly democratically. We take that for granted. We have elections every 5 years, national, and every 5 years, local. We take it for granted. And they are meaningful. And I know certain people who've assumed that they will automatically be in power are running a little bit scared these days because the elections are credible and real. They'll happen. That's quite an achievement. I was in Cairo in Tahrir Square 2 months after Mubarak fell. The people were dancing and celebrating. There's a wonderful ambience there. And today the elected prime minister is in jail. 1,000 people shot dead, the army back in power. They're now locking up the people who led the protests that led to the fall of Mubarak. I was in Mozambique shortly after independence. It was fantastic, radical programs. The enthusiasm was enormous. We didn't have the systems to sustain it. Bitter civil war, millions of refugees outside the country, inside the country. So many people without limbs, which I'm very sensitive to, but mainly without legs because of landmines. We haven't had that in South Africa. We have a press that is noted for investigative journalism. In fact, if you read in some of the papers anything that says anything nice about what's been going on in this country, you think, wow, this is interesting, wow, this is unusual. So it's not 70% good news and 30% bad news. It's about 80% bad news and maybe 20% good news. And rather that balance than the other way around. We take that for granted, and when there are threats to the press, we will know within 25 seconds because the press will tell us immediately and vocally and in a way that's meaningful. When we have disgraceful scenes in Parliament, as we had quite recently, there's a sense of shock afterwards, and shame and embarrassment. It's not seen as normal. It's not seen as the South African way. People are wondering what's going on. We have a judiciary that I'm really, really proud to have been a member of. And now I'm speaking about not a sitting judge, but a former judge. I visit the Constitutional Court quite often, and I come back and I say, I'm thrilled to see how wonderfully it's doing, and sad to see how well it's managing without me. It's really to make the point that we're building up institutions, and we've got institutions of democracy. We had a public protector years back. People complained. He was so meek, he was so mild, he never took up issues. And now we have a public protector and some people are complaining, you know, her teeth are too sharp. Institution for protection of democracy. We have robust, lively debates. We have strong civil society. We have strong communities. Our state can only do so much in this country. Our army is not an army that we feel is waiting to seize power at any moment. We have to be careful they're going to take over. So from that point of view, this is the country I was fighting for, a free, open and democratic society. And while I'm here, and I've used the word open, which is quite important to the organizers of this meeting, you are looking at the person who insisted that the word open goes into the Constitution. And I just might mention the reason for that was having lived in Mozambique. And I loved the sense of power and unity and emphasis that we had in the early days where Frelimo was leading the poor of countryside and towns together with progressive intellectuals to revolutionize and transform the country. But it wasn't an open society. It wasn't sustainable. We had civil war. Brother was fighting brother, sister was fighting sister. I learned not through reading Karl Popper, not through examining the philosophy of human history, through actual experience of living in Mozambique, the importance of having a pluralist, open society. And many of my generations had that experience as well. And I glory in the fact that South Africa is a very open society, with lively, abrasive criticism, strong cultural activities, and people who speak their minds. So that all of that is on the positive side. And I'm sure at this very moment while we're sitting here inside, all the parties, the big parties, the small parties, there are intensive debates going on at the moment. People do not shut up. They speak and they speak their minds, and that's become a South African trait and a wonderful trait. Now, what's the relevance between that and the inequality and the lack of security? I worry that there's too much lamentation and not enough activation. And the lamentation can be self-perpetuating and throwing up hands and decrying the state of South Africa can be very disempowering. If we look at what the Constitution gives us, the rights that have been won, the space that is there, you know, if all the democratic space that's been closed down since I first started hearing people on these platforms had been closed down, we wouldn't be here today. So democratic space hasn't been closed down in South Africa. There might have been attempts to close it down, but you close it down and it'll open up because people will stand up with their cell phones in Parliament and say we demand the right to communicate, and people will apologize and they'll run for cover afterwards because you can't get away with it in South Africa. We've won our freedom, we must use our freedom. On the question of equality, I find it a more complex, and I don't use that word often, complex, nuanced, balanced. Everything can get reduced to its complex situation. We need nuance, we need balance. Sometimes that robs debate of its vigor. But I get messed up in my own mind, let me put it that way, on the question of equality in this country. Because sure, the gap between the very rich and the very poor has increased. But the very poor are not as poor as they were. They are cushioned. Social grants, a third of our population gets social grants. By African standards, that's kind of spectacular. By South African standards, that's spectacular. And there are many complaints that we are not getting development because government is spending too much money on child grants, on old age pensions, on disability grants, and that money should rather be used for investment projects that will bring forward direct investment. I don't know the answer to that. I just know if we don't have a cushioning of the poverty so that people move from starvation to hunger, which is some kind of advance, people move from shacks to RDP houses that are not marvelous, but they're brilliant compared to the shacks, then our country really could enter into total turmoil. And it is meaningful, and it's important in many ways. It's so important for women's empowerment. It's the grannies who get the old age pensions, who've got some disposable money to spend. It's the mothers who have the child grants, who've got some measure of independence. They don't have to become prostitutes in order to feed their children, to put it very, very simply and very, very crudely. So these things are not lacking in meaning in our country. And yet it's shocking to see people I'm surrounded with, the area where I live in, the wealth, the spending, my being asked by a circular that goes round, don't leave nice food in your trash because the poor will come and want to eat it, and that's bad for our security. I just felt so horrified at that. How can people possibly say that, think in those terms? That's thinking in pure security terms. So I'm messed up in my head. I just wish there was more real equality. The unions, okay, that's another whole question. I won't go into that now. I'll simply say that use your freedom, less lamentation, more activation.
Thank you, Justice Sachs. I have a few questions as a comeback, and I'm going to start with you, Justice. That I think there is a point where South Africans and many other poor people across the world are feeling impatient. That we do acknowledge where we are coming from, we do acknowledge how far we've gone, we do acknowledge the welfare we get, we do acknowledge all of that. But what is the prospects for the future? And what do we do to get to those prospects? Because the current reality of many South Africans is that are people who are young today ever going to get a job? That is more thinking in terms of long-term development. Yes, they have access to a loaf of bread today, but what is the tomorrow? And I think that's where the challenge is with current. What will current facilitate development? And that's where the challenge is. And I think when we talk about democracy and an open society, there is a lot of subtle undemocratic tendencies that are not recorded in every day in how people, when they express their frustration, and how the state uses sometimes violence to close down and clamp down freedom of expression, and also freedom of association, demonstration of many communities. So what is your view in terms of how can we get to a point as South Africans of less complacency, finding solutions? What would you say, coming from the history, your history, very rich history of, fighting for liberation in South Africa, but also abroad, taking on some of those insights and experiences? How will we get there? Because I think it's, as you were saying, it's important not to just too trapped to the current. But the current is the reality of everyone's life today.
I don't know the answer. I'd be the king of South Africa if I knew the answer, or the president or whatever. I don't know who wants to be president of South Africa today, but if I wanted to be, I could be that. I don't know the answer. And even if I did know the answer, you know what, I wouldn't give it to you. And let me explain why, and it's not to be discourteous. I'm often asked, what advice, Justice Sachs, would you give to the youth of today? And the banal, obvious thing is you must be as principled and spirited and collegial and so on as we were. That's banal, and people are tired of hearing that, particularly when they see those who were doing all those things are now part of a modern kind of governmental economic system, and it's not playing any big role. So I'm not going to be a party to that. And just by the way, when you speak about speaking truth to power, I am power, or I was power. I was power. It's funny, I was up there. I was one of those influential persons controlling the power of those who have power. And these debates are going on inside all the different authorities. The only answer I give is, advice I give to young people, is don't listen to the advice of the old people like me. Now that's a bit of a trick, because if you listen to me, then you're not listening to me. And if you're not listening to me, then you're listening to me. But what I'm really getting at is we don't have any special wisdom. our strength was to find the solutions in our moments, in our times. We respected our elders and older people. We listened to them in terms of ways of doing things, in terms of not looking for short solutions, in terms maybe of not multiplying your number of enemies, maximize your number of friends, find common ground wherever you can. Don't, for the sake of being pure and radical, isolate people, and don't injure people, and try and use a style of language and work that has Ubuntu behind it. Understand even your enemies and your opponents. But that's pretty abstract stuff. I don't know how much it's going to help you. I'm saying you tell me. Here, let me ask you, what do you propose? What does your generation say is the way forward? We've done pretty well in terms of creating a new constitutional order. We've struggled with every kind of economic approach, different approaches at different times. And the results, they're not terrible. They're not bad, actually. But they're not good. And they're not nearly close enough to getting the answers we want. So I'm asking you, you give us the answer. Your generation must come up with answers. You must start investing new energies, new forms of thought, new challenges, new daring. We were very cheeky when we were young. Respectful in terms of protocol and never wounding and insulting to the older generation, but very cheeky in our ideas. So that's my response to you. Be cheeky, be daring, be bold, try things out, discuss, and see what answers you can come up with.
Okay. And now I'm going to come to Edgar, and I'm hoping Mukelani and Rob, you will come in on that question. You are asking us to be bold, think outside of the box, try something new. How can we do that? Because, that takes quite a lot of risks and trial and error, especially if you are saying, you're playing with fire, this is in our economy. What are you proposing? And, taking at the backdrop of what you said, that there is obviously spaces where civil society and many of people from below, by the way, Justice Sachs, I see myself as power. I don't see power from the top. I see power from below. So for me, that's the power I'm interested in. That's the power that I think many, many states and many governments do not listen to. And I think maybe at the time of your generation, you pushed so hard using multiple strategies to get to be listened to. We are using every little bit that we have today, and every space is closing down. So I guess I'm asking Professor Edgar, within that context, and I'm not just talking about South Africa, across the world, Palestine, everywhere, that how can the generation today organize to get to a point of very robust, active citizenship that begins to address this at a very, very basic level, that will, capture the audience or in the moments of young people who are energetic today to provide the solutions, but not just provide, crack the ceiling there has been a ceiling provided by the elders who are sitting in some powerful positions and powerful spaces, not able to shift and move because sometimes there is a level of being stuck to the old ideas of doing things. And the new ideas and the combination of the old ideas of doing things, what is your proposal? What's the recipe? Maybe just trial and error.
So, of course, the really convenient answer would be to echo Judge Sachs and say, you tell me. So, but I suspect I'm going to be fired from the board, so let me venture an answer. Talk about bottom-up power. The staff of OSF are rather influential. So, more seriously, and to come back to your earlier question and to connect the two, so I think that sometimes, when I sit in debates and hear discussions, and particularly from civil society, I kind of feel like there's a parallel reality that people are in that sort of cuts them off from seeing what is a really rapidly changing world, and a world that is changing at such a pace and with so many opportunities. We can really, if we kind of begin to work at seeing that world rising up around us, we can, I think in a pretty profound way, begin to build a completely different imagination about personhood, about the human, connected with these things, the changing nature of the social, that is both a physical, interactive, emotional thing, but also virtual at the same time. The possibility of not having a clear linear life where you go from one stage to the next, but that there's the possibility of a multiplicity of lives. These are all things that are already refracted in popular culture, and so the youth understand them intuitively in a very profound way. But us as development activists, political activists, and so forth, we are so trapped in a language and in an imagination of 50 years ago that we're unable to activate, as I love that word, the juxtaposition of lamentation and activation. We're unable to activate that. Now, that's all very woolly, but I want to suggest that as we go from a 7.5 to a 10 billion world in the next 25, 30 years, in a context where if China consumes what American working class consumers consume at the moment in 2050, there won't be enough resources for anyone else in the world just by virtue of physics. The resources will just run out. And all the indications are that the Chinese working class and middle class wants to consume at that pace, and they all want a car, and they are going to build the highways to make it possible. So we're in many ways in very, very deep trouble. And of course, I'm using China as a proxy. I can use Indonesia, I can use India. The point is that we have to redesign and reconfigure this world in the next generation. We don't have a choice. We absolutely don't have a choice. And that cannot be a technocratic top-down agenda. So the SDG will produce that technocratic framing to a certain extent, but the practice of it will come from innovations that boil up from this kind of bottom-up empowerment. Now, how do we open that up, to answer your question more directly? I think that it requires a sensibility that is comfortable with contradiction, and I'm sure Judge Sachs would love that sensibility. In the one hand, we have to accept that even if we have a shit government as we have at the moment, we have an amazing constitution that allows us to hold that shit government to account. And that in and of itself is constitutive of the state. The state isn't a set of institutions that are disconnected from us as citizens. We've got a democratic state, so it means that we are part of the shit, right? So the point is that making accountability work, do the work that the Constitution intended it to do, is really important to improve service delivery in the immediate day-to-day sense, and to ensure that those who are serious about transformation in the state have the space to do the innovative stuff, right? And those people are there. Secondly, working with those people and working strategically, we've got to co-produce a set of practices that allows government to go to, let's call it, a second phase of developmental innovation. So government knows, and report after report after report from the government shows that its own programs are not working, right? So it's not news to them, they know. Part of it is corruption and malfeasance, but a big part of it is institutional incapacity and, if you will, lack of intelligence and capability. Not in the sense that people don't know how to type, but in the sense of how do you activate these powerful legal and policy instruments in a meaningful way in a local setting. And then the third one is, linked to that, if you articulate the practice of direct holding accountable and co-producing sort of a next generation of activity working with the state at all levels and with an international register, is this idea of incubating innovation. Now, you cannot incubate innovation if you don't get your hands dirty, both in the sense of working at the grassroots, at the coalface, but also contaminating yourself by collaborating or testing options with progressives in the state and the private sector, very importantly. So it's only once we are able to articulate these things, these three aspects, that we can begin to, I think, birth this imagination that allows us to see a completely different set of possibilities in terms of a new institutional architecture, new citizenship practices, dispositions, and a new generation of grassroots organizations that, in a way, is completely comfortable with the full spectrum of democratic culture and democratic practice. Direct confrontation of power, but also the co-production of alternatives that can ensure access to justice and equality.
Yeah. I would like to add to that and link it to the remark you made regarding the impatience of the poor. And you're saying, why is that? I think in the case of South Africa, what we did in 1994, we linked one ritual of democracy to development. We linked the ritual of elections to the concept of development. We said jobs, houses, and free education. These are the things you will earn by taking part in this ritual. And unfortunately, people say, democracy is a necessary but not sufficient condition for development. But that message hasn't filtered through to the people that are always confronted by politicians every time there's going to be an election. Because politicians go there and they say, vote for us, you'll get jobs and houses. It doesn't follow. It doesn't necessarily follow. I think what has happened is that we've made democracy an occasion. Every 5 years, you will have democracy. While democracy needs to be a daily process. And the daily process requires constant engagement, constant interaction between those in power and the public. It requires that the state be responsive. Earlier, I gave an example of a municipality in Durban that went out and spent 10 billion rands to build houses for the poor, and the poor rejected those houses. They said we were not going there because the houses were built 50 kilometers away from where they were staying. And they were saying, if we move there, we'll be in an even worse economic condition because we incur transport costs, we'll incur higher education costs for our kids, they'll have to come to school, we have to find new schools, etc., etc., etc. And this happens because the state is not in sufficient enough contact with the public. The model of development is quite removed from what actually the people are demanding of the state. I know people will talk about, but we have IDP processes, integrated development processes that inform government what the public really needs and what their priorities are. I'm sorry, but if you read Abahlali Basamjondolo's statement to the Human Rights Commission last week, they say the IDP processes are conducted on purely party branch basis. When councillors go to report to their wards, it's branch meetings of the political party that are called. So, we need to be able to create opportunities for better engagement. The state needs to be responsive, but the citizen needs to have it in themselves to say, I have the right to go and demand to know what is going on.
And then as the last input from Europe, so it's obvious that without governance, democracy, clearly articulated in the Sustainable Development Goals, as you have said that that goal that has to deal with some aspects of that was very controversial. And it's most likely, if it's very controversial, that there's going to be a very watered down text that will manage to get to that goal, to a point where it means nothing. So as a person who is very influential in such spaces and other lobby groups, and what is the text, what is the approach that you are taking in making sure that we don't have another framework that will probably do half full of what we need? I'm not saying that is your responsibility alone. I'm included in that, but because you're in the panel, I'm taking advantage of you.
Right. If I could.
If you could, just share some ideas in how are we going to strengthen the language around, Goal 16. It's very important as setting the scene, setting the condition, allowing the environment for development to happen, allowing the environment for justice to occur, allowing the environment for safety to happen. So if we don't have that environment, is the framework going to fail or, succeed?
Right. I'm just thankful I don't have to answer that previous question that my colleagues on the panel were speaking to, because I was getting a little bit lost. But I did want to kind of just give one reaction, which sort of flows from Edgar's point as well, which is, and I think this is relevant and germane to my answer to your question, which is, I think we are living, and I think it also reflects Albie's point about don't listen to me. We are living in a very different world today than we did even 10, 15, 20 years ago. I work a lot with Google and other large companies on designing kind of not-for-profit new technologies, including stuff that we're testing here in South Africa. And what's extraordinary to me is just how digitally literate and savvy is this generation we're moving into. We have 2.5 billion telephones in the world today. We'll have 5 billion in the next 10 years. There's about 2 billion people on the internet. It's going to double in the next 15. If you think the internet's complicated and crowded today, just stick around a little bit longer. People are empowered now in all sorts of ways that are unhinged from the state, from our notions of national citizenship, national identity, and are finding new communities, new forms of communication, new forms of belonging that I think in ways that I think supersede the state. And that generates big challenges for the state in terms of creating national polities and in terms of ginning up people for elections. So what we're seeing, I mean, among other things, is an increasing, in a way, waning of the commitment of this next generations to the traditional notions of, I think, citizenship as defined in nation states. A kind of new forms of identifying expression, new forms of engaging politically. I had a fascinating meeting a couple of months ago with the former president of Brazil, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who many of you might know as one of the founders of dependency theory, was a great theorist, has probably fewer honorary doctorates than you, but has a handful. And we had a group of young people from across the spectrum of Latin America, people who were business people, politicians, people in the public sector, lawyers, scientists, all there waiting to get the answer from Mr. Cardoso, President Cardoso, about what should they do to engage politically. And his answer was, just don't go into politics. Which was a fascinating response, but I think it was being polemic on the one hand. But he was saying, you folks are going to have new ways of expressing yourselves, new ways of forging change, new ways of transformation that may not be the ways that I pursued it. And he went into exile and had his own experiences. And of course, so it kind of struck people because it wasn't about being lethargic or not engage. To the contrary, it was about find new forms of engagement and harness this globally connected world. Which takes me to the second point, which I think the nation state, there is a disenchantment increasingly with the national processes. And so just as a kind of, you asked us to think out of the box, I think the city, and you'll be happy with this, offers an interesting form of global governance that I think is worth thinking about in new and creative ways. And since we're here to think and reconstruct and think about new possibilities, just consider that 600 cities today account for 2/3 of global GDP. Just take that one fact. Cities are powerhouses, and they often have more to do with those who live in them than the rest of the countries in which they inhabit. I'm not suggesting that we have constitutions for cities, at least not yet. But I am suggesting that there's new forms of action. And if we take the statistics of we're moving to 10 billion people in the next 20, 30 years, and we recognize here in Africa we're 50%, we're going to be in 70 and then 80 in the coming decades, cities are really going to be hubs of dynamism, creativity, animation, political action, foment, discord. They're already the hubs of our violence and justice. So I think there are new forms of belonging, cityness. We go back to that Platonic Greek idea of the citizen. I mean, we're kind of doing a full circle here. But I do think cities are places where we need to think more creatively about action and then thinking about the scale. Anyways, to your question around what can we do with the SDGs? I mean, there's the real scientific world, There's the empirical world where we think we know what's going on and we think we have an understanding of the dynamics of violence and injustice and we think we can explain what might be some of the correlates that link to it. And then there's the political world, the diplomatic world. And those two often meet in awkward and strange ways. So what we have in the text of the SDGs today, of the 17 goals, which I mean, I won't go into how the sausage was made, but let's just say that there have been thousands and thousands and thousands of consultations getting us to this tortured text of 17 goals, of which one focuses on the issues that are the subject of the discussion today. That goal, and I'll read it out: promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Actually, there's a goal 11 that also talks a bit about safety, but I'll leave that out for the moment. That text isn't because somebody looked at the science and the research and came up with a remarkable formulation of how to express that phenomena. It's a product of what was acceptable within the context of 200 plus minus states, some of who have huge interests in shaping a discussion. So it reflects, as all political texts, a compromise, a set of compromises, multiple layered compromises within the UN, which is frozen and paralyzed and has its own tragic, problems right now with moving forward. So I think that I want to make that point, that this isn't the best, this is not the gold standard, this is not what should be there, this is what was possible politically in this particular moment. And we've moved forward incrementally from that moment 15 years ago when it got jettisoned. As for, so my call, of course, is to preserve it to the extent we can. I don't think, because we're moving to negotiations which are ongoing, and there's agreement that will occur in around July, August, and then a signing ceremony in September when the cake's been baked or the sausage has been made. I don't think there's going to be a heck of a lot of change in the formulation of that goal 16. So that's good news and bad news. There's enough countries in the world that said do not touch that text, it's sacrosanct, including, I believe, South Africa and Brazil and India and a few others. In terms of but here's my final point on this particular issue. So we've got a goal and we've got a bunch of targets. One of the targets at the very top is reduce all violent deaths. That's a great target. That's, I don't know if you have the exact formulation. Significantly reduce all forms of violence and related deaths. Yeah, significantly reduce. That's a target. And now what's going to happen in the next 6 to 12 months are indicators. Governments are going to start coming up with discrete, and this is very boring, but discrete indicators and metrics to measure that change. And that's where more horse trading will take place. And I think that's where, frankly, as an advocacy community or communities, that's where we should be focusing our energies. Let's make sure we get really sharp, hard and fast indicators so that we can hold governments at the national to the city scale accountable to meeting those indicators. That's where the work's going to happen. That's where there's still possibility of making an influence. I don't think we're going to significantly change the goal or the target. The final point I'll make is I think this is great. SDGs, we're going to finish in September, hopefully. There'll be this framework. Okay, that's job one. What really matters is implementation, financing, finding ways to actually make good on these commitments. So I want to go back to this point that Justice Albie made before, which security, justice, good governance, these are all intrinsic goods in and of themselves. They've often been cast as means to an end, as opposed to ends of themselves. I think, it's great that we have them in this framework. What this framework does is it gives us a little bit more grist for our mill. It gives us a little bit more impetus to be able to rally around the flag and get our governments to commit more in a more concerted way to these themes. But this is just the gate. This is just the door that we need to go through. And so I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. So I think we should also be thinking, let's think about implementation, let's think about financing, let's think about ways of getting our governments to hold to these commitments.
Thank you. Before I open the dialogue to everyone, I've noted your hand. There is a special request from Justice Sachs, and I would like us to just, please bear with me, that we allow him to share his experiences and then open it up completely to you. No more long States of the Nation addresses. Now you will have to be very precise in your responses because we are running out of time. But this is now your time.
May I ask, who are our visitors from America Latina?
Colombia, Brazil, tem outras, there's a few others. corner here, this side of the house.
This is a message from Albie Sachs to yourselves. It starts, I'm 17-year-old, second-year law student, just beginning, from activist parents, but not politically active myself. And I'm persuaded by my mother to go to a lecture given, it was then Electricity House, by a South African poet called Edgar, on a Spanish poet called Lorca. I didn't even know they had poets in Spain. In my imagination, Spain was a country of bullfights. And I went there, and Edgar had been in Spain at the end of the Spanish Civil War. He spoke for about 3 hours in English, Afrikaans, French, Spanish, and it transformed my life. Because in speaking about Lorca, the assassination of Lorca, the poem by Pablo Neruda, A los 5 de la tarde, he reached me in a totally unexpected way. I love poetry, but for the first time I was discovering poetry that linked with the grand events of the world. The inwardness, the soulfulness, the longings that had been very personal through Lorca, through Edgar, got connected with changing the world. And when people ask me, why did I bring culture into politics, it was the other way around. It was culture that got me into politics. And the next week he spoke on a Latin American poet called Pablo Neruda. Now, if I didn't know that there were poets in Spain, imagine in South America, you had alligators, we had crocodiles. You had the Amazon, we had the Nile. And it was poetry about love, revolution, volcanoes. 2 weeks later, I was volunteering to take part in the Defiance of Unjust Laws campaign. It was just very, very, very direct. So in that sense, I owe Latin America and the Spanish language so much of my past and so much of who I am today. I joined a youth movement, and we were then the only non-racial body in the whole country, here in Cape Town, 15, 20 of us, called the Modern Youth Society. And an older friend of ours, she was an artist, Leslie Cope, and she just discovered the muralists of Mexico. We were so thrilled. And we discovered Diego Rivera. Today he's known as the husband of Frida Kahlo. Then Frida Kahlo was the wife of Diego Rivera. Orozco, Siqueiros. We painted a mural in Bree Street. We were in a little hall there. Cape Town, free Cape Town, the people's Cape Town, with this factory workers, the dock workers, the train workers. The police came in and we were chucked out, it was painted over. But that was part of the imagination, which we got from Latin America, not from Europe, not from North America, not even from Africa, from Latin America. The role of art in reaching out to the people in very beautiful, expressive ways, drawing on the culture of the past. I'm in exile in London. It's a period in the 70s when we are speaking not about human rights, so-called human rights, because we are very cynical. Kissinger is speaking about human rights. He's using human rights to repress revolutionary regimes and meanwhile training assassins to overthrow democratically elected presidents. And so we don't believe in human rights. It's one word, so-called human rights. And I attend a conference in London, and there are people from Latin America, and they're discussing derechos humanos. With the same passion that we're speaking about national liberation, they're speaking about derechos humanos. So derechos humanos converted me to human rights. I had to go from the Spanish into the English. So thank you, obrigado, gracias, aos colegas compañeros de América Latina. Thank you to you. Some years later, I'm in Mozambique, newly independent, revolutionary Mozambique, and there were literally thousands of people who had fled from the dictatorships in Latin America working in Mozambique. It was very wonderful and received with open arms. They wanted to be not just in Europe with a nice job and connected. They wanted to be part of the national transformation. They wanted the passion. They wanted the sense of being involved with a national project. And so we had maybe 500-600 from Chile. We had maybe 200 from Brazil. We had people from Argentina, from many different countries, from Uruguay, and the South African group. And we had a beautiful South African choir, got together with a choir from Chile. And we even had a program to have a joint performance of songs from exile. What delayed things was the Chileans had to consult the Central Committee of the Communist Party in Moscow to get agreement, and by then things were changing. But there was a big discussion, who would get home first, the Chileans or the South Africans? The Chileans beat us by 1 year. They got back home before we did. But I visited Chile in 1990. I was about to go back home to South Africa. I wanted to go to a country where I could cry. I wanted to cry before I went back home. The country that had sun. If I started crying in South Africa, I would never stop. So I went to Chile because it needed to be a country that had known pain but forcing its way through. And it was a very marvelous time to be there. But our comrades from Chile were very sad because the country was getting itself together, but they were feeling isolated, left out. When we went back a year later to South Africa, we felt we weren't isolated. We were at the center of transformation and change. But that sense of solidarity and connection was very, very powerful. Finally, now I find people from Colombia want to know about the South African Truth and Reconciliation experience. We go to Cali some years back, and Desmond Tutu issues an appeal to the FARC rebels. Lay down your guns, come back to the cities, join in the national project. But it got nowhere. The conditions weren't ripe. Last year, I had the extraordinary experience of going to Medellin, not only seeing the new city, which seemed to be improbable before, but listening to a debate organized by the Constitutional Court with 400 or 500 people there, the legal implications of peace with the FARC rebels, and inviting outsiders. Somebody came from Human Rights Watch, speaking beautiful Spanish, very, very powerful, but essentially saying, thou shalt punish. That is the basis of human rights. And Albie Sachs saying, thou shalt knit the country together again. Strong emphasis on peace and mentioning how I met the person who put the bomb in my car. A very interesting, fascinating thing. But what was so marvelous was to feel reconnected with your continent and to feel that some parts of our experience are feeding into your experience. And finally now, our court and your court are the Colombian court, one of the great courts in the world today, the South African Constitutional Court, I think, is also one of the great courts, getting together. It's a South collaboration, not simply in how can we have more houses and a greater GDP, but how can we have more justice? How can we make our society a fairer society? So that's the reason why I'm here today. I love my South African companions and colleagues and all the rest. I wouldn't be here if it was just for that, because there's so many other things I'm doing. But when I heard that there are compañeros, compadres from Latin America, I said, yes, please, and can we make it at a time when I'm available? Obrigado, gracias.
Thank you, Justice. I wish I could speak the language one day when I grow up. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now we're going to open up with no delays the discussion for everyone. If there are people who need translation, please let me know so that I can ask who from Natalie, who is going to be able to translate, because we would like everyone to participate in the discussion without fear that the language is a barrier to the discussion. So I had one hand that I had noted. Any other hands, just for round one? Okay.
Hi there. Christian Andrews from the University of Cape Town. Thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful presentation. I'll be brief. Edgar, you spoke about co-production, new imagination, moving language forward, moving what we do forward. Justice, you spoke about the fact that our generation have to come up with a new world. Yet a lot of the political language in South Africa appears to harken back to the 1950s. And I'm going to say something contentious. I'm going to say Freedom Charter. I'm going to say National Democratic Revolution. I'm going to say Chavistas. And I'm going to wear a red overall and a helmet when I go to Parliament. Please, how do these things that we're seeing every day in our papers interact with what you're trying to imagine? Thank you.
Do we have any other hands before I allow everyone, if you want to share? I know particularly it was addressed to you, but anyone can come in. Okay.
Thanks, Chris. So at one level, I think we shouldn't be fooled by the theatrics, right? I think the theatrics is very much about the fact that we live in a highly mediatized world, and that the theatrics is simply an attempt to optimize the symbolic economy, right? And so what will in fact get you on the front page, what will in fact get you tweeted, what will you get circulated in terms of trying to gain political currency is precisely a kind of a politics of parody, because that's what the EFF is doing. I mean, they don't believe, they don't conflate their symbolic economy that they deploy to try and wrestle away some of the political capital that's available with a belief that a return to a kind of mid-industrial era is possible, right? So obviously, if you're on the margins of the political spectrum in a context where the ruling party is seeped in a certain modernist tradition of socialist rhetoric, you try and flip that and turn it on itself as a political tactic. If you read the manifesto of the EFF, or if you read of the ANC for that matter and so forth, they're all riddled with contradictions because they understand very well that the fundamental basis of the economy is no longer the classic relation between capital and labor, nor a direct relationship with the means of production, right? It doesn't exist. And so the fact of structural unemployment, the reality of a failing education system that is not able to equip our young people for what the economy requires is absolutely patently clear to them. The problem is that in the larger public sphere, we, as civil society and as academics and so forth, are incapable of providing a language and an imagination that becomes indispensable for their ideological project, right? And so I'm less worried or troubled by, if you will, what is a seemingly archaic vocabulary and performative politics. I'm much more worried about our incapacity to speak into that void and provide a set of alternatives.
There's another hand right here. Another one at the back. So I'll start with this one here, and then...
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sembe. I'm a visiting fellow with ODAC. I'm from Nigeria. And just based on what I believe to be the topic, I'm wondering what our definition of inequality is and what our definition of development is. And I say this because, or I'm asking this because recently I was, talking to some people back home, and what I had said was, I was trying to say that, I was trying to draw a link between inequality and violence, of course. But, just reflecting on things that are happening and things I hear on the media, and you find that sometimes it's just a sense of exclusivity, much more than, poverty and all of that. When we think about recently or the revelations of, whoever is behind the beheadings in ISIS, and they say, he comes from a really, a well-to-do family and all of that, and you find that there's that, there are similar examples across. So what really are we saying is inequality? Another example from back home in Nigeria, very recently we had an election, and the person who was incumbent, his name is Governor Fayemi. He was the incumbent. He was a great democratic leader. People would call him that. He was an intellectual in the sense that, he wanted to build infrastructure. He wanted those institutions in place. But for some reason, I think the people felt excluded from it. And they voted back the person who was thrown out. They wanted him back. And simply, the reason everyone would say was that he was a people person. So he was a thug, and everybody agreed, but they didn't mind that he was a thug. He is corrupt. He's now the governor anyway. He is corrupt. People knew that he had stolen lots of money. In fact, he was maybe on our Financial Crimes Commission's list of, people. But, they still wanted him. So he goes to the communities. He sits with them, talks to them, eats the local food with them. He's just free and easy with them. And for them, that's what they had reason to value. And so I'm just thinking that when we are thinking about drawing links between violence and, if he didn't win, there's the possibility that people would raise, arms to defend the fact that they thought he should be the one in power, he's the person of their choice. So I'm just trying to throw these open so that personally, if I was going to be asked what development is for me, it will probably be that I can do the things that are my choice to do, but it may not be what is acceptable to everyone. So maybe I just want to sit at home and cook for my husband, but it's not seen as, for someone like, you're so backward, why are you, that kind of thing. And it's just maybe finding a way that we can give people space to be the people that they really want to be. But also, I guess all of us, our minds have been warped, and we now see one way that may be development, one way that may be, inequality, and we are, we want to just live up to those standards. But is it possible for us to create a space where people can truly be the people that they want to be, whether, and still not feel excluded, still not feel like they are not right, still not feel like being different is wrong. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. This week has been about sort of safety and security, and there's been a number of important interventions from the continent and across the Atlantic from South America. So my questions are really on the issue of safety and security. And so Justice Sachs, I enjoyed your presentation, and something that sort of puzzled me is the conception of equality in the Equality Act, and whether the jurisprudence it tries to entrench in South African thinking would allow for what Advocate Budlender sort of posited in a speech at Stellenbosch last year, where he thought through the enforcement of the Equality Act, greater access to resources and in the case of safety and security, to policing and to the kinds of commodities, personnel, etc., that Judge Cato Regan envisaged in her report on the Khayelitsha Commission last year, whether the Equality Act is a lever for social justice activists in order to enforce greater access to safety and security and the factors that contribute to it. Prof. Pieterse, just on the similar sort of topic, I'm curious, based on your book, which I confess I haven't read, but I read a write-up about it, in which apparently what you argue is that addressing equality of access itself is not going to guarantee political participation, which is really what safety and security is supposed to guarantee. So what then does do that? How then do we get there? Because essentially that's what we're trying, and I think the person who asked the question before me was getting at that safety and security is a means to ensuring the full political participation, and in South Africa, political participation that has historically been denied to a large tract of the population. And then finally, Mukelani, a question for you is that how does open data and sort of access to information initiatives deriving from Cato Regan's report figure in the broader quest for safety and security? Thank you. Sorry, my name is Vinayak Bhardwaj. I am the program manager for, I work at Open Society Foundation.
You want us to react now?
I think is there any other hand? No? Okay. Mukelani, do you want to? Yeah. Or
sure.
Anyone.
Doesn't matter.
Go for it.
It's very difficult to mount any kind of thoughtful, passionate response next to my colleagues here on the panel. I just want to simply say thank you for that intervention and your reflections on Latin America. It's quite emotional, frankly. As somebody who spent a lot of time in both continents, to go back to Colombia today, where you have peace, and we're very close to getting peace, and having marched in those marches pretty much every decade for at least the last 2 decades. I'm not as old as you are. And to see the kind of passion that they display in the face of the kind of adversity is quite an emotional exercise. And so I'm glad that there's learning happening between both South Africa and Latin America. In any case, so I'm not going to be able to provide an impassioned response to our colleague from Nigeria or echo some of the poetry of the language of my co-panelists, but I think the question was something along the lines of inequality, the relationships between inequality and violence, and what is inequality, I think was or how does one define inequality? I think that was the way that you'd pose the question. We often distinguish in social sciences between vertical and horizontal inequality. So we talk about sort of vertical inequality implies income inequality. And that's unfortunately the dominance in the social sciences of econometrics and economics. I happen to be an economist as well. Means that that's often the indicator or metric that we use to measure inequality. And we often don't reflect so much in the social sciences and in the literature on social or ethnic inequalities, or inequalities between groups, or inequalities in terms of access to certain services. Having said that, when it comes to looking at the empirical relationships between inequality and violence, there is a strong relationship. Again, I'm sounding like the dry scientist at the table here. There is a strong relationship between Gini inequality, the lowest and highest quintiles of the population, and violence. So those, where you have societies with high rates of Gini inequality, as in South Africa, as in Brazil, as in Colombia, as in currently today Mexico, you tend to see also higher expressions of violence. There's also a strong relationship between horizontal inequality and various forms of violence, especially between different ethnic, often ethnic groups, and also different groups with different access to various kinds of services. So I think the point is that in your arguments to your colleague, you could say that yes, there's a strong relationship both vertically and horizontally.
Thanks. So just maybe one response in addition to Rob's. So something that has come through in recent work in South Africa and trying to get our heads around why, despite a very substantial proportion of the national fiscus going into development investments, the aggregate outcomes in development terms are not necessarily improving. So we're getting better levels of people enrolling in school, but the educational attainment quality is declining actually, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the sort of analysis that has come through, which is both a product of our history, but I suspect something increasingly in evidence elsewhere, is spatial inequality as a really profound driver that knits together in a way both the vertical and the horizontal questions that Rob was just talking about. And I just don't think we understand enough about it, and I don't think we understand enough about the spatial effects of certain things. So, for example, to go back to Albie's earlier point about, the importance of recognizing that people have access to RDP housing, what the evidence is now telling us, Albie, is that very large numbers of people are leaving the RDP houses, moving back to shacks, because of it spatially disadvantages them from accessing the economy and various other opportunities, right? So maybe that's something that is a useful way for us to begin to think more concretely in terms of how do we take the bundle of goods and services that is wrapped up in this idea of development and connect it to everyday life and how we shift inequality. And it seems to me that as long as we fixate the debate on income inequality, the Gini coefficient, and we don't get to the heart of the question, which is a cultural question. Why is it that people with different incomes, different religious preferences, different languages can't live together? We're kind of missing the point, right? So maybe just sort of an addition to that. And I'm with you on your definition of development has to celebrate difference and respect everyone's choices. So I'm happy for you to cook for your husband or your wife, whatever your choice might be. I have no idea what you're referring to, so you must give me the reference on the book, right? But I think I'd love to read the review. It's one always feels that Albie, I'm sure, doesn't suffer this problem. But us mere mortals, when we write, you feel nobody reads the bloody thing except the reviewers. So it's very nice to know that someone took the trouble of writing a review of something I wrote. But to more seriously to answer your question, so again, so this question of security for me is less, and I've had wonderful debates with my colleagues from GIZ in the last year and a half. They managed to, where's the GIZ people? Have they left? Okay. Yeah, this is a protest because I'm speaking, just for the record. They were sitting on my neck for a year and a half, lobbying me around the importance of safety and security as a key driver of urban development and access to urban development and so on. In the work that I've been doing, leading a national process for an urban framework for South Africa. And my debate with them was the following, which is a way of answering your question, is that I think it is really important to recognize how constitutively important safety is in enabling a whole series of things, particularly in informal settlements and townships, in terms of accessing public life, collective goods, the commons, and access to economic opportunity. No question, no doubt, case made. But the point is that the prior condition, and this is the answer to your question, is that on a whole range of inputs into the reproduction of everyday life, whether it's water, sanitation, energy, housing, a whole range of other services, etc., that there has to be a mechanism for communities to debate, to deliberate in democratic terms, the trade-off between the quality of that service and whether everyone gets access and what's the extent of that access and affordability. That is not a question that the state can answer without citizens. And it is in that negotiation that the calculus about the importance of safety and security in the broad sense of that term becomes a discussion. In and of itself, as the primary driver for the remaking of community life, I think is a misguided notion, and I think it is a fashion in current policy thinking. I think there's a much more fundamental question about how we empower citizens and their organizations to debate in an intelligent spatial way, what I call spatial literacy, the basket of goods and services that makes for a good life in their community, given the constraints of resources and the requirement for them to be part of the design and the maintenance of those services. And that's a very different discussion, which can incorporate the literature that Rob has been one of the leading authors on the importance of security and design. But in and of itself, I don't think it's adequate.
Thank you. Vinny asks about this link between access to information, open data, and security, looking specifically at the recommendations of the Oregon Commission. Even though the Constitution obligates the state to preserve safety and security, I personally am a very strong believer in a people-centered approach to security, safety and security. What that requires is that we change the entire way that we look at safety and security and how it's ensured in our communities. Perhaps to start off with, I would say the crime stats. One of the big issues that came out of that process. I'm a strong believer in real-time accessibility of crime statistics to communities. It's an idea that we flagged with the current Western Cape police ombudsman, and he seems to be also quite supportive of that idea, because as Edgar says, the people need to be, the communities, they need to be able to engage intelligently in these debates. And if access to information and data is not available, then it's quite difficult for them to be able to engage. So I would make that link, and very practically, I would ask all of you to engage with the Open Government Partnership process, because this is when commitments are made for addressing some of these issues. This is when the issues that we are concerned about make it to the National Action Plan, which then informs implementation of this project. So I would encourage all of you to get involved with that process.
Justice, do you want to address the question of the Equality Act and whether it could act as a lever for greater justice?
How many people in this room have heard of Ronald Dworkin? Okay, it's a fair number. How many of you have heard of Robert Badinter? None. My biggest name dropping in one sentence involved the combination of the two. And I was saying, as I was walking on the steps of the Palais Royal in Paris, where I was the guest of the president of the French Constitutional Council, Robert Badinter, I met Ronald Dworkin and discussed the draft Bill of Rights of the ANC with him. In any event, said that to you, but not expecting gasps, because none of you have heard of the people whose names I'm dropping. But an interesting comment that he made, and he was a great friend of justice in South Africa, helped in many different ways. For those who don't know, he died, was it last year? He was one of the top legal philosophers in the United States and a very strong supporter of affirmative action, using his own liberal philosophy to support affirmative action. In any event, he said, Albie, it's a very interesting document, but you include social and economic rights as enforceable rights. Do you have to do that? Can't you achieve everything through equal protection? And that was his approach. It was strong enough. And I thought about it and I said, no. Equal protection just leaves it to the judges, to their political philosophy, and you've got to spell out the right to housing, and the people want to see it. Not this abstract thing, equal protection. They want to see housing, health, education, food, water spelled out in terms. So that was the answer to that. And it's the partial answer to the question that's been put. But it's also to say that maybe there's more to equal protection than has been used, or equal protection read together with the social and economic rights, not as two discrete areas. And the extent to which it's not just progressive realization, but the extent to which certain classes in the community are being deprived of a fair and sustainable access to resources, not through express discrimination because they are black or white or grey or Muslim or speak Afrikaans, but because they are poor. I don't know what the answer is, and it's certainly something worth exploring. What I can say is that we went pretty far on our court. The American Supreme Court actually elevates freedom above equality. That came through, and even above, in a sense, democracy, when it came to striking down the campaign finance provisions, which had been agreed to overwhelmingly by Congress on a bipartisan basis, with McCain being one of the supporters from the Republican side. And here was this court saying that we are non-interventionist, we're non-activists, striking down that measure. The argument the other way was controlling campaign finance gives equal participation in the democratic process. They thought the right to use your money in any way you like is a fundamental right that every born American has that's more powerful than any of these other claims. But even when it came to the question of affirmative action, which we believe brings about more equality, that state intervention, public intervention to overcome, to redress the inequities built systemically through past discrimination, that's been struck down in the United States as a violation of non-racialism, that's the way they would put it. So it's a very, very limited approach they have, unless you actually target a community, a section of the population, for adverse treatment. They don't look to patterns of discrimination associated with who you are. They don't look at the substantive impact of laws. They look to the intention of the lawmakers, as though it's like a claim for damages that has to be proved. We've rejected all that. This has been particularly important in relation to equality between men and women. The way we've looked at the development of customary law, dealing with primogeniture, dealing with equality between husbands and wives under customary law. So we've gone pretty far. And we've tried to pioneer a social and economic rights jurisprudence that emphasizes the indivisibility of rights. It's not a purely quantitative thing. You can't say we've already built 3 million houses for people, so we are satisfying the needs. When some people are left desperately with nothing at all because of eviction or fire or flood, and there's no housing program for the completely homeless and the destitute, then we say that is not a reasonable measure. And we said that takes account of the fact that historically it's black people who are homeless and have been driven off the land. Historically, and in practice, it's women who head many households that are living in the shacks. So you can't separate out the different generations of rights. I think we went possibly as far as we could using that kind of logic, but now it's open to a new generation of people to try and advance new forms of legal rationale that maybe can advance the project. But there's only so much that the courts can do. The courts deal, if you like, with the moral dimensions of citizenship, the principles of what citizenship requires and means. It doesn't build houses. And it's not right that the court should be building houses or provide hospital beds. And it's not right that not only that we should be taking the decisions, we don't have the aptitude to do that. We don't want to downplay the democratic processes. And that worries me so often in these debates. People are looking for an alternative to the vote, public pressure, mobilization, speaking out, public expression, democratic expression, not just at election times, but in between elections, and trying to find a shortcut, maybe through the courts, a shortcut through some kind of spectacular mobilization. And we fought so hard for the vote, we fought so hard for democracy. All I can say is use it. I don't want to say use it or lose it, but I will say it, use it or lose it.
Okay. Right. We now have come to the end of the session, and if you have any burning closing remark, something that you really wanted to say, it didn't make it to your remarks earlier, this is now the time and that moment. And if you don't have, it is allowed to say no, thank you, we are done. But there is one, Rob.
Well, just very briefly. I thought we were supposed to give very quick, punctual responses, and so I did, and now I saw that I lost out my options. But at the risk of keeping you separated from your wine and the extraordinary tapas that have been prepared, I simply just want to echo one comment that was made, which I think is about action, and about what can we do walking away from this, because we've had an extraordinarily rich and very wide-ranging conversation. And one of the things I was struck by that, apart from this idea of we need to decide in this generation and in the subsequent generations how best to engage, I think is very compelling. It sort of unshackles one from the past at one level while being cognizant and respectful of it. Is this revolution in information and data? And I was just struck by the last two comments that my colleagues made. And it brings us back to the post-2015 SDGs, which I think is also what brings us here together. There is this revolution underway right now with information. I think sometimes we feel overwhelmed with it. We're in an information-saturated world. We feel somehow that we can't cope. But if you think we are, I think you have no idea what's about to happen. We're in the Stone Age right now of this information revolution. And the amount of information and the quality of that information and the ability and power of that information is already making problems in faraway places our problems in ways that they never were before. When Brazil had its protests in 2013, which nobody had anticipated, more people on the streets protesting against corruption, against inequality, against violence, against crime, against all manner of issues. You had millions of people protesting online and off. Fully 50% of the tweets and the Facebook postings and all of the social media activity was happening outside of Brazil, in solidarity with Brazil. And when we started to look at the cyber profiles of what was going on in Tahrir Square or in Maiden Square or in other parts of the world where there were protests, we saw the same kind of phenomena happening. We saw people around the world connected in new and fundamentally transformative ways, actively protesting and seeking change. So I think this is a really exciting moment. I think our generation will have to kind of come to terms with this information revolution and ways of engaging it for good. I'm not suggesting that tech is going to solve all our problems, far from it. But I do think that there's a very powerful incentive there for all of us to be getting out there and getting information to the hands of people who really need it. And the stories in Brazil, for example, of the violence that was happening, favelas, we didn't know about that until just the last couple of years, when new kinds of technologies enabled new kinds of empowerment to make known those problems and to make them real for people. So I do think that's a really an amazing opportunity. I think that there's lots of examples of how people are doing that, and to keep the conversation not only happening in the elite corridors of power, but actually on the street where we're going to see real change. I also want to say thank you very much to OSF for hosting this event in this quite remarkable surroundings and for making it possible for us to have this opportunity to exchange.
Thank you. Nothing to say.
Same here.
Same. All right. Justice? Closing remarks? Good. All right. Okay. I want to thank everyone for staying up so late, being a very patient audience. It was a very, very rich discussion. Thanks to all the panelists for their discussion, for their inputs and their insights on the issues. And I hope that this discussion can happen in Kailicha, in Nyanga, in all the areas in the Cape, but also outside, so that this discussion doesn't only, as Rob was saying, doesn't end here, but that's the role I have to play in SJC and everyone who's in the room, that we continue to have these debates and these discussions in places where we can reach more people, to have conversations in areas where we need these conversations to open up, so that people can be, have access to some information that we might not have. Some people don't even know about the SDGs. And how do we get them to understand what they mean for them and what they want in those SDGs to mean for them? So it's important that we, OSF and many organizations who are part of this gathering, who have organized it, that we can take these discussions outside of Cape Town, CBD, closer to the people. But thanks to OSF, this is a start. It's not the end. Thanks to Natalie for inviting me. Thank you, everyone. The wine is served. Bye-bye.